Welcome everybody back to Smooth Finish. So excited to get back together with Mr. Chris Marcano and Rob Romano. How we doing, fellas?
Doing great. Season started, back to work. I shouldn't be here, but let's do this anyway.
The level of commitment is off the charts, folks. Rob Romano gives until it hurts. So it's the season is upon us. It's April. Here we are. Tax day. We just passed. But this is the first time we've kind of reconvened, I believe, since the last show, right? I mean, this is here we are. And we've got a really great topic today to kind of dig into and hopefully demystify and bring some clarity to the topic of cyanuric acid, which is a often misunderstood item when it comes to pools, swimming pools in general. But that's what we kind of want to talk about today from a couple of various perspectives. What the stuff is, why we have it, why it's an issue, why it isn't an issue. And we can bring some anecdotal, real field experience to the conversation, as well as talk to, some water chemistry and the requirements and standards about cyanuric acid overall. So let's just jump into it and get started with the conversation today about cyanuric acid. So I guess I'll start, and kind of with my background being on the chemistry side of things and working with specialty chemicals and water treatment. Cyanuric acid is something I'm very familiar with from that perspective. A lot of people just don't know what it is. It's often called conditioner or stabilizer. It comes in typically granular forms, or you can get a more refined, much easier applicable or an easier way to apply it in a liquid form too. So you either have a powder or a liquid. It's required in most swimming pools that are maintained public for outdoor pools. There is a standard. Typically the number is 30 to 50 parts per million. But essentially what cyanuric acid does is it actually grabs a hold of molecularly when it's added to water. It grabs a hold of chlorine molecules and makes them essentially less active, right? So it actually bonds to chlorine in a body of water. So a chlorine molecule basically will come in contact with something and it has a reaction with it, right? So it bumps up into something in water and it tries to chemically essentially burn it up or kill it if it's alive, if it's a microorganism or something like that. So what cyanuric acid does is it actually complexes the chlorine molecule and makes it less reactive. So if something does bump up next to this cyanuric combined with a chlorine molecule, so it is just less likely to immediately interact with that contact, that thing in the water. It still will, it's just slower. So essentially the chlorine will have to let go of the cyanurate molecule and then go attack something. And what typically happens is another chlorine molecule will then kind of reconnect with that cyanurate molecule. So you have a standard of 30 to 50 typically. That's recommended. So if you have that part per million of CYA in your pool, it's just constantly reconnecting and working with the chlorine that's introduced into that pool. So I will kind of pause there and we can chop that up if you guys would like to.
Well, that was super scientific, Chris. No, for me anyway, layman's terms, right? Yeah. So for me, CYA, the abbreviation is, cover your ass in some ways. So
it is. But, that is true.
Yeah. Yeah. But I always had it explained to me as kind of like sunblock for chlorine, right? It makes it more efficient. It lasts longer. You're not burning through chlorine and that type of thing. And I wanted to ask you one other question from my perspective, layman's pepper. Isn't trichlor tabs or whatever, they have cyanuric in them, correct?
So, yeah, absolutely. Great point. So you're right on two fronts, right? So cyanuric acid, CYA conditioner stabilizer, whatever you call it. It's got some regional colloquialisms. But essentially, if it's in the pool, it's going to complex or connect with any type of chlorine that's put in there, right? And a lot of people just kind of vaguely, because it's a very easy way to explain it, right? It protects your chlorine from the sun. It's UV, it protects it from UV degradation. It's like sunscreen for your chlorine, which is really true because essentially when you have complex chlorine, when it's bonded to this molecule, this cyanuric acid or cyanurate molecule, basically it's going to last, rule of thumb tells you it's going to last about 8 times longer when it's directly exposed to sunlight, right? So being an unstable thing, chlorine will kind of gas off or spin out and degrade itself if it's exposed directly to UV. So CYA, right? It does. It makes that chlorine last longer. Again, it just stabilizes that unstable molecule, making it less reactive with stuff. That's the bottom line. So Brent, you're exactly right. And that's kind of the rule of thumb explanation that's out there in the industry. And another thing to remember is that cyanuric acid stabilizer conditioner, it can be added independently as a standalone item. Remember, I mentioned that it's in a powder form and a liquid form. And again, if just want to throw this out there, if you're using the dry powdered form, it is a very, 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 very slow dissolving item. So I wanted to emphasize that. It takes forever to dissolve, right? It's slow. So do not add it directly to the pool water because it will sink down to the bottom and you can run into some problems with that, which, obviously we want to avoid contact with the pool surface, obviously, with this stuff. But so it comes as a independent, aside from everything else, standalone item that can be added in a couple of different forms, a powder or a liquid. Or a lot of people don't realize that when you use a tablet in a swimming pool, which is the most common way, a trichlor tab, great products. They keep the water free from disease and bacteria. They help maintain a balanced, healthy body of water. But when you use those are basically going to be, give or take, it depends on what kind of tablet it is, but rule of thumb, about half of that 8-ounce tablet is going to be cyanuric acid in some form. Like it's going to be a form of CYA. So just by using tablets, you are introducing CYA into your body of water. So even if you haven't added cyanuric acid as a standalone, you can still and will still develop it and build it up as a residual in your pool by adding chlorine tabs or using chlorine tabs to that body of water if they are trichlor tabs. There's also some calcium hypochlorite tabs, different type of chlorine that's unstabilized. So that's very rare though for backyard or even, most residential pools are not going to utilize that. That's more of a commercial application. But if you're using the standard 3-inch larger tabs, basically a rule of thumb, it's safe to assume that about half of that volume, so 4 ounces of an 8-ounce 3-inch tab, is going to be cyanuric acid in a dry form. So it will build up in your body of water, even if you're not adding it independently. So a lot of people get surprised by that too. They'll be like, well, hey, I don't know why my CYA got high, right? Why it's testing high by this standard. It's above 50. Why? Well, if you're adding a lot of tabs and half of that is basically getting introduced to that water, once CYA is introduced into water, it stays in the water, right? It doesn't just miraculously disappear. It doesn't evaporate out. You've got to remove that water to lower that CYA level. So that's another kind of misnomer out there where this stuff come from. If you're not adding it by itself, it can build up in your pool water from simply using 4-inch or 3-inch chlorine tablets. So that's really how it gets in the pool. If you're not putting it in yourself directly, it's going to build up to a level over time by using chlorine tablets.
Chris, I think that's, really what that tells us is, the industry thinks it's important for what it can do and help in water treatment and all that good stuff. And I think really that might help us segue over into what we have to watch out for, the CYA, the other term. As far as like for cementitious surfaces, right? That's our core audience. Oil, the industry is, but this is important for them to hear, and our people like why is it important? What do we need to know about cyanuric acid? Is how can it affect pool finishes? Those types of things, and you know, I know total alkalinity, right? There's that portion we hear that quite a bit, and adjusted alkalinity. So I think probably a good segue here, and I know Robbie's got some firsthand experience and some stories he can share of when these things aren't monitored and what's happened out in the field. So here we go, right?
So yeah, so what happens when you have a cyanuric acid? It affects the alkalinity reading because it's an acid, right? So when you're testing alkalinity, it can throw your alkalinity reading off. If you have, for example, an alkalinity reading of, let's say, 90 or 100, and you have a cyanuric acid reading of 100, you're supposed to take a third of that from the alkalinity reading. So you're going to bring that down from if it's 100, you're going to subtract 30 points from that, or 33 points from that. So your alkalinity, your true alkalinity, is now going to be about 70. And alkalinity is so important to a pool's finish that if it's in an once it's below 80, you're really in an aggressive state. Your water, if all the LSI calculates out, you'll be in an aggressive state, and that can pull from the finish. It could pull material out of the finish. So if you see these little circles floating around there, that means the pool is etching, and you can ruin the finish that way. So it's kind of like, I remember my early years about calcium, and not to make this calcium, but calcium was not important so many years ago. Now suddenly calcium is one of the more important things to consider when you're balancing out your pool, because if there's not enough calcium in the pool, it's going to etch the pool, it's going to pull it from the surface.
Right.
In recent years, cyanuric acid has become known as a culprit for a similar reason, because when your pool, when your pH and alkalinity are low, what does that do? I've always been taught, how do masons clean their tools? They use acid to take the cement off the tools. When you're in an aggressive state, that will actually eat away at the plaster, because it's a lot of cement in there, and it'll eat away at the cement and pull that apart.
Yeah.
So, I mean, my best story in this case was a pool that I looked at last year. Was a quartz finish, a pebble fina finish, and when we it was a high profile customer out in Montauk, and they builder built the pool. We put the fina in. He calls me almost a year later and says, "What's going on with my pool? It's got all these dots all over it. What's happening over here?" I go, we do our forensics and all that. I test the chemicals. I test the cyanuric acid. Cyanuric acid is off the charts. I go, "What's going on here?" Well, I pass it off to this pool company, the service company, and they were putting in 25 tablets a week.
Wow.
A week.
Okay, so that's 4 ounces.
This is
4 ounces.
yeah.
I couldn't do the math. I can't, like, what? I mean, an average pool might take like 4 or 5 tablets a week to put in. 25 tablets a week. So this thing was not, there was scale and etch all at the same time happening over here.
Yeah.
And I had to dilute the sample twice. So if you're, long story short, if you find that your cyanuric acid, if you can't read it, I think that like a Taylor kit, for example, goes up to 100. If you can't do the test properly, you have to dilute the water. I had to dilute it twice to get the true reading on this thing. It was something, it was over 200 parts per million. It was insane.
Definitely get into trouble. I mean, that's the bottom line, and it's misunderstood about what it is, why we need it, do we need it, and the answer is yes. It's very valuable in the overall picture of water quality, right? Especially when you're trying to keep water free from disease and bacteria. But like anything, when you get out of bounds, there's problems, right? And to your point, understand what gets you out of bounds, and then how to also accurately test. Because to your point, you know, basically you have to take, Robbie, you're exactly right. You've got to take your total alkalinity number, right? You get your alkalinity. It's, you know, it is what it is, but always factor in this. And this is, people just neglect this and they don't do it. But whatever your total alkalinity is just a number of the sum of all these parts. You have to subtract a third of your ppm of CYA, right? Of cyanuric acid, whatever that level is. You take 1/3 of that and subtract it from that total alkalinity, and that gives you your true reading, and it's called carbonate alkalinity, but that is your true alkaline level in the pool. So that's the accurate snapshot. And at 30 parts per million, it's a factor, a third of that, you know, it's a factor of 10. That's not going to kill anybody. That's not going to throw off the system there, right? But if you're at 100, like Robbie, you're talking about, or 120 or 150 or even higher, that's going to screw the entire summation of your water chemistry out of whack, right? And you're going to have issues. And you're exactly right. If it's acidic, the water's going to take stuff out of the surface. If it's base, if it's the other way, it's going to deposit things. It's going to leave behind. So that's really what it is. But understanding where CYA comes from, number one, is a big start to this conversation. And then to Rob's point, understanding how to accurately figure out your true water balance, you know, you have to know and test and factor in the CYA. So again, for review, your total alkalinity minus 1/3 of your CYA level gives you your carbonate alkalinity. It tells you what your alkaline level really is, your true reading.
Chris, so is it the same as adjusted alkalinity, the term we've used already?
Yes, yes. So
just for clarity. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. And that's it. Adjusted alkalinity is a much more digestible term than carbonate alkalinity. I'm just so used to dealing with the PhD nerds that
you're such a scientist, Chris. You're hurting us here.
Oh, yeah, trust me.
In layman's terms,
adjusted alkalinity, it's real easy. Total minus our factor gives you your adjusted alkalinity, which is the way to go.
You know, it's and I brought up the calcium comparison because for years we didn't understand what calcium did to pool finishes. Now we know, and it's not like cyanuric acid is a new problem. It's something that we've learned over. It's getting the message out, kind of like what we're doing right now, and helping our service companies and builders understand that when we install a finish, it looks great the day it's done, but you start introducing certain factors like tablets, and this is nothing against tablets at all. Right. It's just understanding what's the reaction to your action. So the reaction to putting tablets into a pool is that your cyanuric acid gets built up, and it gets built up to a point where, okay, this is now starting to affect the finish. How do we get this down? So when you're doing your testing, when you're doing your regular maintenance of a swimming pool, and you're using I'm not promoting Taylor, but we're using like a Taylor kit, put it in your regime that if you're gonna, when you test for calcium hardness, test at the same time for cyanuric acid, because it does take time to build that up. It's not an instant thing. And when it does build up, know how to react to it. I know there's some chemicals out there that help reduce the cyanuric acid, but the tried and true way is really, you might have to dump the pool a little bit because to dilute it and to bring it back up to or bring the cyanuric acid down to a workable level.
Yeah. So, no, Rob, you're exactly right. There's products out there that are marketed to remove cyanuric acid levels. My company makes one, right? So, but I will say this. The most tried and true way to do it is by dilution. So once
refresh
your CYA, once CYA has been introduced to a pool, whether it was added intentionally as a standalone, item, or through the buildup of using trichlor tablets, whether they're 1 inch or 3 inch, it doesn't matter. They're still made up of the same material. So it builds up either way, but once it's in solution, once it's in the water, it stays in the water. So the best way to remove that level or to lower that level is through dilution. It's instantaneous. There are some products that will remove it over time. It's a process though, and there's some issues with that as well. So if you're not wanting to remove water, if you're in an area that has water restrictions due to drought or something like that, there are options.
Wells. Yeah.
But typically, if you want to get that level down and you're identified it as it's out of whack, it's too high, and you want to take immediate action, the best way is just to dilute that water, and do so with caution, right? You don't want to just drain a pool all the way down and then refill, right? That's oftentimes not the best solution. Dilution,
guys, am I right too that the levels are really high, or if there's so much in there that it'll actually block the chlorine from doing its job? Algae,
yeah.
I mean, chlorine block or lock, they call it. Is that that's a thing, right?
Yeah, so that's a generic term. Yeah, that's a generic term. But the bottom line is, remember, this will grab a hold of chlorine and complex it, making it less reactive. So if you have an abundantly high level of CYA in your water, it's going to be constantly complexing and essentially, and this is just kind of a generic term here, but overwhelming the chlorine molecule, so it's just not able to do its job, right? A little bit of CYA in a regular in a normal level, right? An acceptable level. So say 30 parts per million. Again, typically, I think, and I default to Taylor too. They're a great company for these standards, but 30 to 50 for a residential pool parts per million is about the safe landing spot. If you're in that, it's kind of the Goldilocks. It's the sweet spot. But if you get much outside of that range and go higher, you can start to have this effect where your pool isn't acting normal, right? I have chlorine in there and I have high CYA, but it's just not working. And that's when you can run into some problems. And the issue is that the chlorine's basically so wrapped up because of interference with molecular action between the CYA that's in the water and the chlorine. The chlorine's not doing what it's supposed to do, and that's kill diseases and bacteria and bad stuff in the water.
So, Chris, so we know that the byproduct of chlorine is chloramines, and you shock the pool to get rid of those chloramines.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a way to tell the difference between cyanuric acid, other than testing it? Can you tell if there's a difference between the two?
Well, yeah,
I just thought of it. I never thought of it till now.
So yeah, no, there's a clear difference, obviously, but there's definitely a test for total chlorine and then free chlorine, right? So and CYA typically isn't going to interfere with that test. However, I'm pretty sure, and I'm no expert when it comes to the DPD and different reagents that companies like Taylor and Lamont specialize in, and AquaCheck as well. All great companies that
Dax Magic.
Yeah. And well, exactly. So essentially they're very dependable reagents and products out there to test that immediately test the difference between total chlorine and then free chlorine, which basically takes out the combined chlorine factor there. But and combined chlorine is going to be different than chlorine that's actually complexed by the CYA. I think that's what you were kind of getting at there.
Yeah.
That's the CYA combined, or the chlorine that's in water, that even if it has attached to CYA molecules, it's still going to test as a total chlorine number. So it doesn't hide it per se. It doesn't mask a test, but I'm pretty sure that because it does act like a buffering agent, the CYA, that it can act like a buffering agent, hence the fact that it has to be factored into when you calibrate your total alkalinity. I'm sure it can interfere, most likely, with different reagents if it's extremely high, right? And that's
well, it does that with the alkalinity test. It throws it all off. You could test 120 parts per million, but if you got 120 parts per million of cyanuric acid, I don't know what the math is on that. It's 40 parts you're taking off of there, and your alkalinity is in an aggressive state, and that's what you want to avoid.
Yeah, the bottom line, like anything, right? If your water is completely acidic, if it's so far down the pH scale, there are certain things when you go to test your water that aren't going to test, right? It's throwing off, it's too extreme. And CYA, cyanuric acid, is very similar to that. If it's extremely if it's extremely high, it can throw things off. And you know, again, just be aware of that. Too much is not a good thing, right? It really isn't. And I'm going to go on just out here personally. I know the standard's 30 to 50 parts per million. I'm always a less is better guy, right? Like I'm less, definitely, like don't overdo it. So I like to stay closer to 30 than to 50, just because I would rather, we don't have problems, these bigger issues that can compound in a body of water, especially as they relate to the surface of the pool, but overall wellness of the pool and just the, you know, how the water chemistry lines out. We don't have problems when the CYA is at 30. We have problems when the CYA is above 50, right? That's
Right.
when you
Yeah.
start
Yeah.
to experience
Exactly.
this. So if you stay on the low side of acceptable, you're that much farther than that area, you know, where it's going to start causing issues. So I tell people, keep it around 30, maintain it, you know, lose some water occasionally during the season, and you should be fine. But don't overdo it. You know, if you overdo things and you're not testing, you're going to have problems.
So from where I stand, or from where I sit right now, if you're using tablets, like I said before, make sure you're doing at least once a month. You're testing for cyanuric acid, and make sure that that is not over the 50 parts per million. There are some municipalities here, especially in New York, that don't allow cyanuric acid at all.
That's right. Yep.
I'm not sure I fully understand the reason behind that. Maybe this is it, but you can't have any, like, so you could not put a tablet system or a tablet feeder on a commercial pool in New York, or in some places in New York. I'm not sure the whole state, but regardless. So know what your municipalities are doing. But when on the residential side, there's a lot of tablets are king, in my opinion. They love it here in the Northeast. Take the time to test for it. I can't hammer that home enough. I really can't. Because then I get the call. This is I'm the complaint department. I get the phone call. What's going on with my pool? And I can go there and say, hey, this is it. And everyone's scratching their head. Why is this happening? And it really comes down to awareness, which is what this podcast is about, of understanding what the effects of CYA does to your pool.
Yeah. I mean, the bottom line is if you look at the swimming pools in North America, the predominant sanitization method is going to be erosion, you know, tablets, right? Like erosion feeders, or even something as simple as putting tabs in a skimmer basket, which is highly not recommended. But it happens, right?
But
like,
it's a reality.
A couple tabs in my skimmers, and I've gone in backyards before where I live in the Midwest. It's almost all tabs. And I've gone into backyards before where I've pulled out skimmer baskets that had 9 or 12 tabs. Right? It was all tabs. And again, half of those, that total volume, is CYA, and it's getting put in the water. And that's not a problem until it becomes a problem, right? If you put too much of anything in a body of water, it will become a problem. So again, test, be cognizant of where it's coming from, know why you're putting it in, don't overdo it. You know, and that's really it. And I want to bring up another thing is saltwater pools. Okay. So the way saltwater, you know, obviously they're very popular, and there's that's a whole different episode. But if you look at a chlorine generator manufacturer, right, from any of the big legitimate ones, they will typically recommend a little bit higher. And I think they've kind of changed their position collectively on this. But initially, they would recommend a higher level of CYA. And essentially, that was just to complex that chlorine that was being made by the generator So it lasts longer, right? So they want their machine, which they're great machines. They're very cool. I mean, the technology is undeniably neat. You know, it takes salt that's dissolved in water essentially and creates a hybrid molecule that is chlorine. So it's a little mini, almost chlorine factory in your swimming pool system, right? So the chlorine that it's making though is low volume. It's not making massive amounts. So they want that level to be protected so it looks like their machine is performing. So it makes sense. Plus, they want their machine to perform. So they recommended a lot of these manufacturers a higher CYA level. And this industry, as we all know, more is better, right? You ask anybody, more is better. So you had a lot of builders at one time. And I think the learning curve has kind of corrected this, hopefully, but I do want to stress this. There was a lot of folks out there that were selling generators, and they'd say, hey, go ahead and add 3 times more CYA, add 5 times more CYA to your pool because you need it. It needs to help this. So that was another whole bag of problems that we inherited. And again, education kind of breaks through that bad habit. So you don't need any more CYA in a saltwater pool than any other type of pool that's using chlorine, right? It's for chlorine pools, and that includes salt, and follow that standard 30 to 50 for the most part. Check your own, local regulations, but 30 to 50 is the Goldilocks, whether it's a saltwater pool or not.
As a plaster applicator, salt has its own concerns. The nice thing about salt is that you don't have to, it's not generating any more cyanuric acid, and you have it, you can bring it to a level, and theoretically it could stay there because the salt generators are not generating cyanuric acid.
Yep.
So if you reach a level in it and you're able to maintain that because you're not putting tablets or something or adding more stabilizer into the pool, you're in a good position with that.
No,
So
it's a total valid point. Yep. The chlorine that's being generated or being created in a saltwater pool is not the same type of chlorine that's in a chlorine tablet. There is no additional CYA being introduced in the process of a saltwater pool.
So if you're one of those guys that have been able to manage a saltwater pool, then kudos to you, because it's all a whole other issues in the startup of an early starting up of a swimming pool.
Yeah, I detect
cut that out.
a whole nother episode on saltwater systems.
Yeah.
My experience and my comment always.
Dave, you can cut that part out.
No, don't cut that. Super efficient, right? They were sold like the Ronco of kitchen equipment. They were the Ronco of pools. I mean, they were just an easy sale, and there's so much more that you need to know about them and what they do with the water. So we will get onto that. But I was going to say, I mean, Chris, from what I didn't know some of the things that you've shared today, so it's great to hear. And it just, from my former days looking at pools with, and just when you'd walk up, and this is I think this catalyst of what we're talking about protecting, when you'd see a tablet floater, they got stuck on a top step. I mean, here's the point, right? So the things that we're concerned about in the finish, it had etched a hole where it had got stuck. It had bleached out all the pigment in that area if it was a colored finished pool, and it was just nasty. So I think that's where we've kind of gone full circle. Is we know it's a useful tool, but too much of a good thing is a bad thing, and almost everything in life. So
out of whack is out of whack. And to reinforce that, because there's been so much confusion and blame and this and that, and salt's terrible and salt's great. Look, the bottom line is that chlorine generators are really cool technology. They're here to stay. They're not going anywhere. But we can all admit, going back to the early days of their popularity when they quote unquote kind of boomed, they were oversold, undeniably oversold. We all have heard this. I have a saltwater pool. It's chemical free. I'm allergic to chlorine. I have to have a saltwater pool. I'm like, you guys don't understand. I mean, it's not exactly like bleach per se, right? But it essentially is making a form of unstabilized, very reactive, so quote unquote effective chlorine that's kind of similar to bleach, right? To liquid chlorine, but it's making that perpetually in the pool. It is chlorine, undeniably, it is chlorine. And so these people, I mean, I've had these conversations, you know, like, oh, what do you do for a living? I'm in the pool and spa industry. Oh, really? Like my neighbor, they have this saltwater pool. It's chemical free. They're allergic to
silky on my
chlorine.
skin and everything.
It's infuriating. So the all you know, excuse my French here, but all the bullshit that was sold, and to Brent's point, it was the Ron Coquille food dehydrator. You set it and forget it. And the bottom line is that if you are using, though, as it relates to the quality of water, if you've got a saltwater pool, right? If there's a chlorine generator in the inline system, it does not require any more CYA than any other form of chlorine sanitized pool would. It's the same requirements. It's the same standards apply there. The same principles apply. The science is the same. But it is a different set of parameters that you have to adhere to, just because mostly there's a lot more dissolved solids in that body of water because of the extreme amount of initial startup of salt, which is, again, it's a whole different can of wax. You know, salt and you know, there's some additional precautions, as we all well and know. And if you don't know, check the startup card and refresh your memory for your processes, for best practices. If you are dealing with a finish and startup of a saltwater pool, don't add that salt up front. Robbie, how long should they wait? How long should they wait?
Well, the NPC card says 30 days. Rob Romano tells you a year.
A year.
A year.
So yeah,
it avoids all problems. That's a whole other conversation.
Yeah, whole other conversation.
It's not a poo-poo against salt. Salt, for all the right reasons, works well. It's just when you have a new finish, you got to take care of the chemical processes that are going off on a new finish, and managing the pH in a new pool, and then you add salt to it. Like I said, another conversation. You just got to know how to manage all of that. Going forward, guys, when you're dealing with a chlorine generator, cyanuric acid is not as much a factor as it is if you're using other forms of chlorinating in the pool.
Yeah. Listen, I have very smooth skin now, and I'm wearing my sunblock like the chlorine. And I think we've approached a really smooth finish. What do you guys think?
I agree.
Chris, well, thank you for the knowledge today.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in, everybody. And remember, check out the links. And if you want to get more information, and we'll be doing another podcast. I believe we're recording one next week at our meetings. We're headed to lovely Chicago next week.
Yeah.
And we're going to be doing another one of these, hopefully sooner than later. But thank you all for listening, and hopefully this was helpful.
We've also updated our website.
There you go.
It's now nationalplasterscouncil.com. So you can find a lot of this information.
Make sure you get that right.
I said it right.
Yeah, I'm just saying it again so they hear it.
nationalplasterscouncil.com.
So let me translate. Plasterers, plural. National Plasters, plural, council.com. It's the proper name of our organization.com. Check it out.
Absolutely.